Hello and good afternoon. My name is Erin Wagoner, and I'm Foundation Specialist with Corporate Partner Services for Chime Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Enabling Better Healthcare ERP Software Selection. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to cover just a few technical details. The Q&A area is located on your screen option bar. This will allow you to ask questions during today's presentation. To ask a question, type your message into the Q&A chat box and press the send key. The speakers will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you're having difficulty listening to the live audio stream through your computer speakers, teleconferencing is available. To display the teleconference instructions, click on the Communicate menu to view the audio options. By attending today's session, you also will earn up to 1 continuing education credit. Please be sure to visit the Chime website for more details. And also, please take a few moments to complete the evaluation that will automatically pop up in your web browser at the end of the session. Your feedback is valuable for all of our future programming. And just a quick reminder, all registrants for this event will receive a PDF copy of the slides and a link to the session recording following the webinar. So with us today, I am glad to introduce Tanya Townsend, Senior VP and CIO of Louisiana Children's Medical Center, and Tim Oberschlake, former CIO and current Vice President with AVAP. Tim and Tanya, I'm going to turn things over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate the opportunity to come to the Chime group today. We will have some introductions here in a second and talk a little bit more about our background. But before we get there, I wanted to sort of maybe put a couple slides up to get you thinking about what's at stake with system selections here, going forward. The first slide you're going to see is the bottom line is, that decision making for adopting an ERP cloud really today requires a different way of thinking. And why is that? We're going to get into that today as we move forward, but it's not the same thing as it used to be with legacy selection processes, and we'll talk through that. But the other thing just to note, and this is from a recent KLAS decision insights that we received actually just last week, and it's sort of showing cloud ERP purchase decisions over time. And again, you guys will get copies of this, but again, it's highlighting the need for this information we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of organizations out there considering selections, considering cloud ERP purchase decisions. And again, that's really what we're trying to focus on today. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and do some introductions. So first, let me turn it over to Tanya, and she can introduce herself.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the opportunity to tell our story. I'm Tanya Townsend, Senior Vice President and CIO of LCMC Health, based out of New Orleans. I also am the chair-elect of the Board of Trustees of Chime, and I won't go through the rest of those bullets, but I've been a CIO for about 12 years and in the industry, healthcare IT specific industry, for about 20 years. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tanya. And I'm Tim Oberschlake, a Vice President at AVAP, specifically on our healthcare division. As you can see, I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I was a CIO for 13 plus years. The vast majority of that was in healthcare, was a Chime member way back in the day. Again, there's I guess a lot of CIO experience that hopefully we'll bring to you today as we work through this content. So what are we going to be talking about today? So really, the initial focus is really going to be focusing on what's changed with system selections, because the title's a little awkward, especially if you're looking at doing a selection and you're thinking, well, I can just do it the way I've always done it. It hasn't changed. Well, we're going to talk to you a little bit about why it's changed and go through some of the things you should be thinking about. Then we're also going to talk about, with Tanya here, obviously, we're going to be talking about a case study of a recent selection they did and what LCMC Health has done. And that case study will be used as we go through that new software selection process that we've laid out. And we'll be talking specifically about, certain deliverables, certain things that LCMC has done and how that's helped in their process. And then again, at the end, as was talked about before, we'll open it up for questions at the end of the session. Okay, so let's start about what's changed. Now, obviously in this picture, you see the old CRT screens. I'm not sure, it depends on the age of the people on. You may not even remember those. I remember programming on those myself. But anyway, today the systems look so much different. We're really going to cloud systems in moving the infrastructure into the cloud. And cloud ERP systems are really where people are going in the future. And because of that, a lot has changed with system selections process. And I think this particular slide does a really good job of sort of highlighting the core reason for that change. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see, the legacy selection process where the hospital or the system was in the center. And you were analyzing all these vendors trying to figure out who can best meet your needs. And it was really centered around, focusing on all those tactical things that you have to do in your back office, and making sure everybody could do it. In today's world, it's a little bit different because in the cloud space, really the hospitals or the systems are coming to the software. So in the cloud space, everybody is sharing the same code line. So there could be 15, 20, 100, different organizations using the same exact software that you are. And really the focus at that point has to be strategic. In other words, what's going to differentiate you going forward? Those are the areas where you may invest in some additional configuration. But the overall, as we'll go through the different components of a selection and how those have changed, just note that the real key thing here is moving to that cloud space. The vendor or that vendor software package is really at the center. So how has that impacted a selection process? So we have the legacy approach on the left, the new approach on the right, and we'll go through each one of these. First of all, requirements. One of my pet peeves, I guess, when I look at RFPs out there is you'll see RFPs that come out to vendors. And again, if you've been on both sides of the house, you'll have seen this. But as a vendor looking at an RFP coming out, I can sort of tell where someone's culture is. Are they ready for a cloud? Or are they just trying to replicate, what they do today, sort of paving that cow path, so to speak, and they just want the same system they have today with a different architecture? Well, in order to avoid that, the new approach for selection is really focusing on what needs to be changed in lieu of how. So in other words, we want to see the ability to, create a paycheck. We want to have the ability to enter a GL line. We want the ability to, do open enrollment. How we do open enrollment is not as big a concern because each software vendor is going to bring their best practices that have been used at hundreds of other clients to the table. Certainly, they're highly configurable. You can make changes, slight changes to those. But what you want to do is bring everyone to a best practice. And the question you should be asking in that is, is what I'm doing in my GL, is it really strategic for the organization? And most of the times the answer to that's going to be no, it's not. Those back office functions are more tactical. So doing it one way versus the other isn't really going to give you a significant benefit, as an organization. So thus standardizing on that best practice business process allows you to do a lot of things differently going forward. And we'll get to those. The second thing you'll see there is leadership of the selection process, and for that matter, the implementation. In the past, it used to be a very technical implementation. You would say, here's what we have to do. The technical team would basically lead it, bring everyone to the table, be a key part of the process. And what you see with the cloud approach is it's more functionally bent. Now, why is that? Well, when you're bringing everyone to the software, you're asking your business areas to actually change and transform from what they're doing today, from that path that they're taking today, and do things in a best practice way. That means they have to transform what they're doing today to the new approach in the future. They have to be part of the process. And getting around that, it should not be even a discussion point. You have to make them part of the process. And even the implementations, we do implementations with the new cloud ERP softwares fundamentally change because it's an iterative approach where we're getting prototypes in front of functional users very quickly and asking why not, instead of saying, what do you do today? Okay. Now, on a people side, because we're making those transformative changes, you know, it used to be that we had tried to avoid change by keeping things the same way they used to be. So we avoid it. We do it the hospital way. Going forward, organizational change management is at the forefront of adopting, these changes into your organization, and really the people and the technical side of things coming together to get a cohesive implementation is very important. And that starts in the selection process. And the last thing we have here is sort of that future state. In the legacy systems, again, because you heavily customize those systems traditionally, you really were dealing in a selection process more theoretical. Can the vendor truly do what you're asking it to do? And they would say they can. They may have a couple of clients that may have done something similar, but there's a lot of theoretical in the selection process. In the future state with the selection processes, really we're dealing with known quantities. In other words, what we have with most of the major cloud vendors, they have these value assessment teams. Before an implementation's done, they sort of take baseline numbers. After these selection processes are done and implementations are done, they'll come back after stabilization and do another check. And what they're really doing, it's really for their sales, they're really focusing in on what have we changed with this organization? And because people are coming to a best practice, this can be replicated in your system going forward. So now when you do your selection and you're doing your business cases, you can do it with real numbers, with real results that other clients have achieved. And you can think and really rely on the fact that we are going to be doing it the same way, which is a fundamental change in the approach. So let's talk a little bit about the case study we're going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to Tanya, and she can talk a little bit about LCMC Health and where they were at the start of their selection process.
Sure. So I won't go into too much background about LCMC Health, but we are 6 hospitals in the New Orleans market. We are about 2,000 beds total across the system and 12,000 employees. What probably makes us the most unique is that we grew pretty rapidly through mergers and acquisitions over the past 10 years or so. And anyone who's gone through mergers and acquisitions know that you inherit a lot of history and legacy and cultures and various processes, various ways of doing things, and that's exactly what we experienced. So where we're at today through that merger acquisition process is we have 3 what would be considered core ERP systems. 2 are the same vendor, but completely separate instances built 2 completely separate different ways. And now we have a 3rd that's being introduced. All 3 of those systems are what we would now consider to be a little bit more legacy. The vendors that support them are now moving into the cloud-based direction, cloud-based systems that Tim mentioned. So the foreseeable future is that these systems will be sunset, no longer supported. So they served us well. Our first instance was installed in 2002, so it's going on nearly 20 years old. In addition to these core ERP solutions, there's also a number of third-party systems that make up different pieces and parts of a full ERP. So we have dozens of those that also are different or the same but separate instances. So to continue to manage all of that is not ideal, but then we also have this burning platform and time frame of the clock ticking with these core systems being sunset in the near future. So that's kind of what got us here today, to understand how to pick a new ERP and get everybody into alignment on vision, strategy, culture, and standardizing our processes.
Great. Thanks, Tanya. So let's talk a little bit about the process. Now, again, we use the LCMC Health, and I will say, as you look at these different stages in the selection processes, a lot of this is going to look fairly familiar to you, but really the order of the way we do things is going to be a little bit different. Now, I will say that each of these stages, they're shown in sort of this chevron format left to right. For example, we have organizational alignment at the beginning. That's something that we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second, but that's something that's vastly different than what was done, previously in previous selection processes. Obviously RFPs, requests for proposals. Again, in LCMC's case, we didn't really do an RFP, but we did get proposals from each of the main vendors. Vendor analysis and recommendations, we'll go into some detail there. We'll talk about business case development. Now, in many cases, after the organizational alignment, organizations may want to immediately do the business case and get the results of that before they proceed forward to getting proposals. And again, as we go forward, one of the recommendations we have at the end is make sure you partner with somebody that knows what they're doing in this space. It can't be someone that doesn't know ERP systems, because one of the things that you want to do in that business case is you want to make sure, okay, that you're dealing with someone that knows what it takes to implement, what those costs are going to be, know what the costs are going to be for the different software systems. So again, if you do want to do that business case earlier and you're partnered with someone like that, they can bring that knowledge capital to the table so you can actually do that early. Then you have negotiation and contracting, which again, very similar to the past. And then pre-implementation. And pre-implementation is even more important now, and we'll get into the reasons why. But again, going to a cloud system with a lot of transformation and change having to happen, there's a lot of things that have to happen before you start your implementations to make sure you're successful. So let's talk about that first chevron, the enterprise program management that sort of overrides the top. Again, one of the things you'll want to make sure of is that, again, you partner with somebody that knows these industry leaders. These are the cloud ERP leaders that are out there. You'll see that on KLAS surveys. You'll see that in Gartner Group, industry, across industry. You need people that understand each of these vendors and what they have to offer. And again, there is a tendency in some cases we just partner with one. In that case, you're going to get a biased view. You need to make sure that you're seeing a clear view of everyone. Structured deliverables, making sure that we have a steering committee that's involved in the process is vital, because we're going to be transforming the organization. If that steering committee isn't engaged, we need to make sure that we get them engaged, because we're going to be making decisions here that are going to be impactful across the board with the organizations. So again, this enterprise program management sort of encompasses everything that we're going to do here, but it's important that we get that governance structure in place, before we proceed forward. Now, I don't have an extra slide in this area, but Tanya, is there anything you want to add to that as part of the governance committee and LCMC, and maybe how you saw that program management working?
No, not a lot to add, but this was, again, because we were all different cultures and different organizations and managing all of this independently, this was an opportunity to come together as an enterprise and start to come up with shared governance principles, shared guiding principles, and get the team to collaborate with one another that they perhaps didn't even know each other prior to.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that. All right, so let's go to phase one. So the first part, and we've talked a little bit about this, organizational alignment. So when we say organizational alignment, what do we really mean? Really, at the end of the day, and you'll see when we would do an implementation of a cloud system, we would also do an organizational alignment at the beginning of the project. So we do them at the beginning of a selection, we do it at the beginning of a cloud ERP project. The whole idea is begin with the end in mind. And when you do that, you're more apt to success at the end. So first we're going to define the project. What are the current challenges? What's your strategy? What the objectives are, et cetera. Then we're going to talk about, in the context of the business, who are we going to be touching in your organization? Where's the solution? I mean, what other systems are involved? Can they be replaced? Can they not be replaced? Getting the definition of what we're really talking about from a scope perspective is vital at the beginning of this, and making sure you get everyone together to collaborate on that. And then from a planning alignment perspective, what's our roadmap look like? What are some of the assumptions? Again, I won't go through that whole list, but the idea is we need to plan out what that implementation might look like. Now, you would ask the question, why does that have to happen in selection? Well, again, begin with the end in mind. If you're going to have a solid business case, you need to understand, what that full picture looks like, as you proceed forward, because the costs are going to be very dependent upon the way you basically would implement after you select a system. So that's part of that overall total cost of ownership. And then the last piece that I would have on here is the stakeholder alignment. Now, I'll point this out. It's very important, that you get the entire organization moving in the same direction in these type of engagements. So before we ever start, doing anything with communications to a vendor, we want to make sure all this is done. And then we get everyone in a room and we basically have the selection team. And in the case of LCMC, we had the selection team actually present to the governance team and saying, here's what we want to do, here's how we want to do it, and then each step along the way, we had people in the room, actually raise their hand. Can you live with and support, each of the things that we've presented? So slide by slide, we said, can you live with and support this? And the reason we do this is we get consensus around the key stakeholders to make sure everyone is in alignment before we proceed forward. We don't want any hidden agendas. We don't want anybody going after the meeting and saying, well, I didn't really agree with that. And then notice it doesn't say, do you agree with everything? It says, can you live with and support it? Because getting total agreement at an organization the size of LCMC is not going to happen. Okay, but getting people on the same page and willing to live with and support a direction is definitely doable and it's needed before you start the process. Okay, so let's dig into a little bit more detail. And again, I'll turn some of this over to Tanya so she can talk about the details. But on the strategic intents, this is something we got from the governance committee before we actually engaged the selection team. So Tanya, can you talk a little bit about the direction you all gave us at the beginning before we actually started, working with the selection team in that alignment process?
Sure. I'll pick a couple highlights here without going through all of them, but we had just recently gone through an electronic health record consolidation standardization process, so very similar to what we're about to embark on the ERP side. So one of our first guiding principles going into it was to know that not everything is perfect on day one. Having gone through the EHR implementation, we know that we needed a culture of continuous optimization. So knowing go live is only the beginning, we wanted to just set the tone for that right away. If we can't boil the ocean over 12 months, this will be a continuous process going forward. Because we are an organization that continues to grow, we wanted to make sure that that was one of our guiding principles so that we had a scalable solution that would be ready and able to quickly adopt any future acquisitions or future growth. This one's, I like the way we word this one, guided autonomy. So another unique part of our organization is that we have a very vast span of services. So we have one hospital that's completely freestanding pediatrics, our Children's Hospital of New Orleans. And then we have all the way to complete academic medical center, level 1 trauma center, and community hospitals in between. So what works at children's and pediatrics doesn't necessarily standardize over to the adult market or our academic medical center. So we realize that we do have unique needs at those vast organizations. So we call it guided autonomy, meaning we're going to come up with some standards. We want to have a collaborative culture so that we meet on most matters that can be standardized, but allowing a little bit of flexibility where we can allow for some autonomy based on those niche differences. And then the rest is kind of the standard efficiencies. We want to reduce duplication. We do want a more stable IT infrastructure. We are in New Orleans and we had quite a hurricane season this year. So remaining on premise could be risky. So that was one of our opportunities as well, as to get to the cloud and have more scalability and resilience and security. And then the rest was, again, more around efficiencies and how we can come back together as a system, standardize and really leverage the tool to perform better with the resources that we have.
So our governance team at the beginning, with the CIO, CFO, CHRO, along with some of their key people, basically gave the selection team a very clear direction up front saying, these are strategic intents. So what did we do with that? Well, what we did with that was we said, okay, based on those strategic intents, let's go through the detail and define this project. And quickly, we had several alignment sessions with that selection team where, again, we went through all the things that define the project. But one thing we asked the team to do as we've went through and we agreed on what that scope was, is let's talk about, what is your vision? What do you want to see when all this is done? What is the tagline? And again, Tanya can actually weigh into this a little bit more maybe, but you can see the tagline, one heart, one solution. You can see some information in that vision around, quality first. They actually made this their own, and they weaved in the culture of the organization. So Tanya, you want to add any more to this in the vision and tagline? I know you guys use this all the way through the business plan and even to the board to get approvals, right?
Right. I don't have anything further to add. I think you summarized that very nice, Tim. But yes, one vision, one heart. That's our tagline.
Okay, very good. All right. So, and then, what we did with those strategic imperatives is we then basically tied objectives to those. And then with each of those objectives, how can we measure success at the end? Okay. So how are we going to say, that we did X on the project? So again, they took the imperatives, the strategic imperatives that we talked about before, created objectives, measurable success factors at the end. Now, why is it important to do this in a selection process? Again, let's go back to that fundamental truth, is beginning with the end in mind. It's vital that before we get started, we understand where we're going, because that's going to guide you the rest of the way. When you come up with your proposal requests, when you decide what your criteria is going to be, et cetera, it's going to guide you the rest of the way. So let's talk a little bit about phase 2. All right, so proposal and RFP creation. Now, in the case of LCMC, the bottom line is we didn't want to do a formal RFP, but we did want to get proposals from the different vendors to make sure that the business case was based upon reality and it wasn't based on, maybe historical references. So again, we did get the proposals out there, and you can sort of see that's the typical things you would see in an RFP here, but it's also what the request was requested from the different vendors, when we asked for proposals from them as well. And then prior to those RFPs actually proposals being requested, we also then went through and went into detail about selection criteria. What's important to the organization, and we went through each of the different evaluation criteria. We assigned points to them, and then we actually, underneath that, and we sort of show a little bit of detail, ability to meet requirements. In core HR, what does that mean? Well, remember we said we're really focusing in on what to do, not how, right? So when you look at that, ability to track position qualifications. So we want to make sure they can do that. Okay, we didn't say, track position qualifications in a certain way. Okay, we didn't say the how, we're saying the what. And we did this across each of the different functional areas as we do it. And you can sort of see with these max points, we ended up making this a very systematic process where, again, it's not going to be an emotional decision that's made by the selection team. It's based upon what's important, to the organization as you go forward. So Tanya, anything you want to add to that selection criteria, or anything from the governance team's perspective that may be highlighted, do you want to highlight there?
I would just add that this was a very important step. It says phase 2, but it was almost step 1 for being on the same page with what the criteria were, and then coming into alignment on how to weight those different criteria. Not all of them had equal weight. So I would highly encourage, when embarking on a project like this, that you do just that, and make sure that everyone is in alignment on what that criteria is and how to ensure that it's got the appropriate weight for the final outcome.
Great. All right, so let's take the next phase, analysis and recommendation. Now, in the analysis and recommendation, you're going to see a series of steps here. And again, we won't go through each one of these in the call. I'm not sure we have time to do all that. but I would call out, that there is a number of steps here, and it's important that we touch each of those boxes, if you will. And we've highlighted the total cost of ownership because at the end of the day, and we'll show this in the next slide, coming up with a total cost of ownership was really important to LCMC. It was one where we wanted to make sure that we had all the cost accounted for across the board. That meant we had firm proposals from the vendors. We understood, what the implementations would look like, what was required for backfills of people, et cetera. And then all of that was addressed then in the vendor scorecards before final recommendations were made, to move forward. So let's go to the next slide, the TCO inputs. And again, Tanya, maybe you want to weigh in on some of this, but we were very detailed about the capital cost model, the operating cost model, potential savings, and how did that weigh into, I guess, to the decision processes that were made as you saw these inputs and as we started the development of the business case, which would be the next phase?
Yeah, I would say here, the biggest challenge is to just define what should and should not be included in your TCO. We had to go through multiple iterations, and having been a CIO for a while and having done multiple business case analysis or TCOs, you've seen one. So really define what you need in your TCO and kind of get the buy-in from your financial committee or CEO, et cetera, whoever has to do that final review, make sure that we're including all the right pieces. But I would also just encourage or give advice that it's not just looking, especially when you're going through a conversion, which is what we're doing. You have to look at both the new cost, the net new cost to implement the system and what that's going to look like, but also understand that there's an interim period of time where you're still paying for your legacy or current systems, and there's an overlap period in between. That oftentimes can get overlooked when you're doing your TCO. So that would be my biggest piece of advice, is to make sure you don't forget about that part.
Very good. All right. We had a pretty elaborate spreadsheet, I think we had at the end there that we came up with. So next phase, we'll have the business case development. And again, on the left here, you're going to see the key components of the business case. Again, as Tanya said, the bottom line is this isn't going to change a whole lot about what's in a business case. Perhaps, the way it's presented within an organization may differ, but it's really important from a vendor perspective that we understand, how an organization views these type of things, that we can basically meld ourselves. It's the same components, but how it's presented is going to be important. And that executive engagement and alignment, if you will, is really, really important to understand how we're going to ask for approvals moving forward to make sure we hit the mark, so to speak. Because some organizations certainly value certain pieces over others. I guess there's not really another way to say that. Tanya, anything you want to have from your business case experience that you want to share? We went through multiple iterations of this with multiple committees as we went through approval processes.
Yeah, like I said, I think the biggest piece that we kind of went back and forth on is to include those current software expenses that are really part of your TCO until you can officially decommission and retire those systems. But also I would encourage, the big piece of your TCO and selling your business case is to focus on your business benefits. And so as a CIO or as the IT leader, some of these benefits are more about human capital management and supply chain savings. So encourage or partner or collaborate with your peers to make sure they can tell that story. I can't convince my CEO that we're going to reduce FTEs in the finance division, for example. The CFO really needs to be able to tell that story. So that's what I would also encourage, is make sure that those business benefits can be backed up and that your peers are doing the talking on that.
That's a great point. And I think when we saw the process at LCMC, we saw the CFO and the CHRO really step up and do quite a bit of ownership of all of the benefits that were listed. And that wouldn't have been able to happen if their team wasn't heavily involved. So going back to that discussion about this not being a technology project, it being a functional project, is vital. not just during the implementation or at the selection, but even getting the approvals in your business case. You really need joint ownership of this going forward. And that truly does lead to more successful projects, on the back end as well.
Yeah, completely agree.
Great. All right, so let's go to the next phase, negotiation and contracting. Really, we've basically broken up negotiating contracting into really two sub phases, if you will. And one is really those things that are strategic, and then the things that are tactical. And really, when it comes down to it from a negotiation perspective, a lot of times when you get to this stage, you're obviously going to have a vendor that's sort of leading, if you will. You may be in a situation where you have someone that's also very close, and it's a close race, if you will. In those type of situations, it's really important that that phase one, negotiations, those critical strategic requirements be dealt with first. Because if the primary vendor can't meet your strategic requirements, you may need to go back to your second vendor in quick order. In our case at LCMC, I don't think we had a whole lot of those strategic requirements that we hadn't already dealt with in the rest of the process. But again, depending upon the situation, there could be key things that you as an organization, it's fall on the sword time. You can either do this and meet our requirement here, or we have to go elsewhere. And that's really what those strategic requirements are all about. Let's identify those immediately. Let's make them the first first salvo, so to speak, in the negotiations, and realize real quickly, are we on the same page and can we move forward? Or do we need to go to our backup, so to speak? And then you also see the tactical negotiations. And really, in between, you'll see a bunch of additional work that's happening to get to those tactical negotiations. And I'll give an example. One of the things that we did, at LCMC was we had several additional demonstration sessions with key pieces of functionality with the selected vendor. And in doing that, we were able to round out that portfolio of products that were going to be part of the final deal. And we had to basically get some additional input from key team members, that may have not been key parts of that selection team, but we went a little further and dug a little deeper to make sure that any contract can be something, at the end that LCMC can benefit for years to come. We didn't want a bunch of things in there that hadn't been looked at or weren't part of that overall selection. So again, the tactical negotiations, strategic negotiations, both are vital. At the end of the day, you come up with the best and final offer and final contracts, but there's a lot of work to get there, and you can't minimize this phase because you're going to live with the results of this for years and years to come. So a lot of people basically take this very quickly, and they don't get everything that they could out of the negotiations. So again, I'll stop there. Tanya, anything you want to add to the negotiations and contracting, specifically the way you guys did it and maybe the results you got?
So I won't focus necessarily on just the contract negotiation. I just, as far as giving advice to others that might be going down this path, this is one piece of the puzzle, kind of back to the TCO, is just, I would recommend taking a similar approach on all of the different components that do make up the entire TCO. It's not just whoever the final ERP selection is. There's many other parts of the negotiation that would happen as well. And then there's also pieces that can start before you actually launch and complete this phase. So just think about that too, is if you are in a similar situation where you've got a timeline ticking and you have a legacy system that is about to go unsupported, just think about all that preliminary work you can do in tandem while you're working through this process and these negotiations.
Very good. All right, and let's move to the last phase here, the pre-implementation. Now, again, when you're going to, a cloud package, like, LCMC chose Workday, and they're moving in that direction. When you're going to a cloud system like that, it's really, really important, whether it's Workday, whether it's Oracle Cloud, whether it's Infor Cloud Suite, it's really, really important that we actually look where we need to go in the future and get things ready for the implementation. Because, and I'll give an example in LCMC's case, like Tanya talked about, we have 6 different hospitals. There's in many cases 6 different ways of doing things. And it's really important that we tackle some of those key, call it cultural issues. And in some cases, consolidation type issues before we started the implementation. Otherwise, you're going to be doing that in the midst of, design sessions, architect sessions, in the midst of the project, which will elongate that process. And every minute, of the process in the implementation, you're actually paying the subscriptions in the cloud product world. So it's important that you have everything sort of laid out and together as you go into that, so that you can get things going very quickly. Examples here, BI assessments. Do you have, a data lake as an example in place in your organization, or a data warehouse strategy? Because one of the biggest costs in an implementation is your conversion processes. Do you really want to convert 7 years of history into a new system? Probably not, because that's going to be a huge cost. You're replicating all of that history, if you will, into a new system, but you need a place to put it for compliance or what have you. Making sure you do that BI assessment is vital. Change management, people side, where are you at from a people perspective? Is there going to be resistance? What's the change strategy need to look like? And from a process perspective, in LCMC's case, they had item master consolidation that's going on right now. 309,000 items being consolidated down, to probably a sixth of that across the organization. Well, that's work that would have had to have been done in the implementation, but it's being done ahead of time in their current system so they can proceed forward in a more systematic and progressive way during the implementation. So again, these are vital things that you have to do before you start the project. So Tanya, anything you want to add to the pre-implementation work? We're right in the midst of that right now.
Yep, we are right in the midst of that right now. And I guess I would just focus on the change management piece. That will be very big for our organization, because I mentioned it earlier, but we have 6 different ways of doing things, 6 distinct departments. And so whenever you kind of merge things together and shake up things, then there's the who moved my cheese kind of mentality. So that's the piece that we want to work through carefully, is understanding the cultural shift and focusing on that. And thankfully, I have really strong peers that I'm working with, both the CFO of the organization and the CHRO, who are definitely champions with me. We are 3 executive sponsors that are all in alignment. It's not just one person responsible for this project. We all take equal ownership. So that's definitely something we are cognizant of, aware of, and going to focus on during the implementation.
Right. So this really is the place where you start your transformation, if you will, and it's vital that that happens ahead of time. Again, in some organizations, you're going to have to do not just change with the project. Maybe you have to do a new shared services organization where, instead of having, one part of the organization spread out, maybe you're centralizing that. Well, those decisions have to happen up front, right? So that you can actually implement things in a progressive way, in a systematic, in an easy way, actually, once you get there. Okay. All right, so in review, some of the key things out there, beginning with the end in mind, aligning on the project objectives and expected outcomes up front is vital. That alignment process, I would say, is one of the most important things you're going to do as an organization. And it's one of the ways you can ensure the success of not just the selection, but the future implementation, is making sure everyone is rowing the boat in the same direction. Okay. Business transformation, doing the what in lieu of the how. Okay, so making sure that you're partnering with a group, in my opinion, during the implementation, that's going to be asking the question, why not, rather than what do you do today? Okay, that's really, really important that happens, because you don't want to pave, the old goat path, if you will, and do the same things you did before, with a new system. All that is an expensive new system at the point if you do it that way. So you don't want that to happen. you really want to think out of the box and make sure you're coming to that best practice business process as much as possible across the organization. And then the last thing is partner with software experts. I know there's a lot of folks that say, well, this is just a selection. We can get anybody to do this. And I would say, especially in the cloud space where you're coming to the software, it's vital that you partner with organizations. And again, I'm not going to be as self-serving to say it's just us, but partner with organizations that actually know the software. They're implementers as well as helping people with selections, because they know the software, the ins and outs, what's good and bad, the warts, the good, bad, and ugly, and they can help you through the process and be a true partner and guide in lieu of, having you guys learn it for the first time after the selection process is finished. So I'll stop there. Tanya, anything else you want to add, maybe to end review, or maybe learnings you've had through the process that you might be helpful to the team or the group?
No, I would highlight that last piece that you mentioned in terms of having a solid partner that you can trust. Like I mentioned, our systems are 20 years old, so we hadn't done this in a while. So wouldn't consider ourselves experts at going alone in terms of the assessment and advice around how to do this. So I would just highlight that last piece too. Definitely partner with someone you can trust.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you. Well, I think we're going to be going to the Q&A now. So it looks like we have a couple of open questions. Let's see, if LCMC has, I'm trying to read it from Mark. If LCMC,
I can read it off if you want, Tim.
Okay, go ahead. That'd be great.
Perfect. So I've got, if LCMC has 6 quite different hospitals with all of their different histories and cultures, how do you get them to agree with a single vision for a future ERP solution?
All right, I guess I'll take that one. I think part of it was we had huge success in a similar process around the electronic health record and revenue cycle side. So I don't think we had to work through nuances of differing opinions, and we weren't having people think that we still needed 6 different ways of doing things. We definitely had alignment as a culture. We had grown to come together on standardization. So that was step 1. But then secondly was that scorecard that we mentioned earlier, and we brought together members of each governance committee or subject matter expert group with representatives from each of the hospitals, and kind of did that, can we live with this? Maybe not everyone was in full agreement, but we did the can we live with this approach and came up with a scorecard that we all agreed to, and that's how we finally scored everything and came up with a solid winner.
Excellent.
Anything to add there, Tim?
I don't think so. I think you did an outstanding job answering that one.
And I think this kind of goes in with the same, it's also from the same attendee. I understand that all 6 of your hospitals might wish to configure things differently, but what if one hospital genuinely does need a different set of logic or functionality? How do you do this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can probably take that one. The bottom line is you want to come to a common set of basic business processes, but there are going to be slight differences in each of the hospitals out there. What you want to make sure you do, and each of these systems are still highly configurable, they're just not customizable. So understanding where things can be configured and where they can't is a key to making sure you know where you can flex there and where you can't. And again, that goes back to that knowledgeable partner, making sure they can understand those nuances. Again, you don't want a bunch of exceptions out there, and you really do have to push back on those to make sure they truly are needs during the implementation. But the bottom line is there are legitimate reasons why, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be the 2 different hospitals or, one hospital versus the other 5. It could be, one department, or one area like finance has to do something slightly different than what happens in nursing for an approval process. I mean, if that's the case and there's a legitimate business reason for it, these systems are configurable to allow for that. But you just need to push back when necessary to make sure you're getting as much of that, common, business process as possible. Tanya, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you answered that very well. I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier when we called it guided autonomy. So kind of the 90-10 rule, like 90% of what we do should be standard. And you leave just a little bit of opportunity or flexibility for true business needs. So for example, pediatrics versus adult market might have some nuances because of that's the patients we serve, but it should be almost a 90-10 rule is what we typically try to focus on.
Great.
Okay, so the next question I had come through is, you'll probably get to this in the presentation, but would be interested to know which ERP vendor was chosen and ultimately why.
I think we did, Tim did briefly mention that, but yes, we did go with Workday. And I do see another question here, which might be a follow-up question around, were we open to looking at different vendors for human resources versus finance and supply chain? So Tim, I'll let you chime in too, but we did have that conversation early on because I know other organizations have gone down that path. We ruled it out fairly early on because we do feel like the vendors in this space have made significant progress towards having an integrated solution across all three of those functions. So while that might have made sense a few years ago, it didn't seem to have as much necessity now. So we did kind of rule that out early and thought for the investment we're about to make and the level of integration that we want across those service lines, we wanted to go with a single solution.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, market data that we looked at as part of this process sort of confirmed that approach as well, because what we're seeing is more and more in the market, almost a 2-to-1 margin is in healthcare. Selections that are being made are being done more at a global level. In other words, the entire group of products, HR, finance, and supply chain, in lieu of, let's say, just HR. Now, there are organizations, to be fair, that are maybe in a very different place. They have something very mature, it's working very well, everything's organized, working very efficiently, let's say in supply chain. Maybe that isn't part, maybe it's HR and finance and supply chain stays. So every organization is going to be a little different. That's why it's important sort of begin with the end in mind. There are significant benefits for being on one platform. With the sharing of data, et cetera. But I'm not going to sit here and say that that solution is what should be done in every organization. So we'll begin with the end in mind, understand your needs, where you're trying to go to, and then go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the next question I have come through is, how do you balance the benefits of standardizing business processes ahead of an ERP project with the risks that processes will need to be redesigned once again based on how the new ERP best practices work?
Okay, let me start with that one. I think one of the things we're doing in the pre-implementation is we're really working on consolidating things that will basically inform the project. So in other words, the item master, we already talked about consolidating that. That way it's an easier conversion into the new system, into Workday. What we didn't do and aren't doing is we're not sitting there and changing the business processes in the current system in preparation, for the new, because part of the business transformation is going to that new best practice business process in the new system. And that's part of that transformation process. I think the people, and this really is legacy, if you will, people that sit there and map out all their business processes, it may be good information for you as you go in so people understand, maybe what you do today. But it's not something that can be replicated in the new system. Again, you're going to best practice, you're not repaving what you do today. So, and a lot of times those investments are not, in my opinion, worthwhile because it's not something that's going to lead you forward. Okay. Tanya, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is kind of why I mentioned earlier that while you're working through this process, don't think that you can't get started before the project actually launches. There are business processes that you can redesign in your current state if you have the luxury of time, resources, etc. So if you ever have the career opportunity to do an EHR and a ERP at the same time, which I don't recommend, there are decisions that you have to make when you're doing your EHR implementation that might be rework when you eventually do the ERP, which is exactly what we experienced. So one of our what we're calling phase 0 pre-implementation activities is the item master standardization consolidation. I wish we had done that during the EHR implementation, but we just didn't have the luxury of time and resources to tackle that at the time. But just consider that. What are the things that you can move forward on before you make this big decision around ERP?
So the next question that came through is, how well did your ERP project track to the original plan in terms of time and cost?
We have not launched yet. We're officially on phase 0. We just completed our contract negotiation. So we are just in the process of standing up the project, standing up the team. So we'll have to get back to you in about 18 months.
The selection did well.
Yeah, selection went very well according to time and budget.
So the next one I had come through is, Workday and other cloud vendors have said that because of cloud, more of the support work is shifted to the operation teams and therefore reduces support from IT. Did you reduce any IT staff in your TCO?
So I'll let Tim kind of speak to this a little bit more, but from just a strictly IT resources standpoint, where we're already pretty lean, we do have a lot of decentralization between HR and IT and who does what as far as the analyst work goes. So we're already pretty lean on the IT side. So we feel our work is probably going to be repurposed more than eliminated, but we do have opportunities like that in the TCO in HR and finance.
Yeah, and I think what you do see, and this is one thing we did with the alignment, is we tried to make sure everyone understood what does, beginning with the end in mind, what does the future, organization need to look like to support, your cloud ERP system. So we had those conversations up front, and we know that we're going to be building functional leads into, HR, into finance. There's going to be some areas where they don't even have staff today, that they're basically going to be, have staff working. For example, FP&A and finance, there's not one today, and they will have that in the future. But the bottom line is, as Tanya said, I think there was, in most of the areas, there was actually a pretty lean organization right now, and there was lots of functionality gaps. So I think it's really more of a repurposing than it is, of eliminating, but there definitely is a shift from technology to functional support. In other words, your functional areas are going to be much more involved in the cloud ERP space than they were in the past. Because again, it's very focused on manager and employee self-service, and it definitely empowers your key functional users to actually maintain the system going forward in the future rather than relying on IT to do so.
So we're coming up on time, but there was multiple people that asked this question, and I think it'll be pretty quick. How many, where is it at? Shoot, hold on, I lost it. How big is your IT team supporting ERP?
So if I had to identify the folks as specifically ERP related, it's about 5. And their titles or skill sets are analysts versus DBAs. So it's already pretty lean, like I mentioned, and I do believe going forward, it'll still probably be around that number. It'll just be maybe different skill sets and repurposing folks. Maybe not as much DBA needed, more analysts needed, for example.
Right.
Well, we still have several questions, but don't worry, guys. I have copied the questions. I will be sure to get these to Tim and to Tanya so that they can do some post-session outreach in order to get you those answers. I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's attended today. We appreciate your attendance, and we hope you enjoyed the session. And I want to say thank you to Tim and Tanya for presenting as well. Any closing remarks, guys?
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. I appreciate the opportunity as well, and it's nice addressing the Chime community. I used to be part of Chime way back in the day. It's nice to be re-engaged.
Well, we're glad to have you as well, Tim. And thank you so much, Tanya. And I hope everyone has a really great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.